Do you recognize the signs of the times? Are you concerned about what you're seeing take place in our culture today? If so, then this podcast is for you.
How do I bring my faith to work? How do I tap into the power of God in my work-life call? Why am I going through this adversity? Is God mad at me? I'm Oz Hillman, and I've been helping leaders like you answer these questions and more for over 30 years. That's what this podcast is all about. Let's learn and grow together. Welcome to TGIF. Today, God is First.
Hey guys, great to have you this week in our podcast entitled Culture Shaper, How to Be God's Culture Shaper in an Increasingly Unchristian Culture. You know, I've been following culture for many, many years, and my core book on culture is called Change Agent, Engaging Your Passion to Be the One Who Makes a Difference. And, in writing that book, I discovered, kind of the history of America, how we began to shift America's influences over the last 50 years from being a moral culture to becoming a secular culture. And so in this session, we're going to help you understand how we got there and what can we do to change it. And how do we live in a culture that's becoming increasingly unchristian and anti-Christian in many ways in our world today. So to begin with, I want to show a video that was actually a radio show in 1964 by Paul Harvey. And if you're old enough to know who Paul Harvey is, then you know that he was a guy in Chicago that was on the radio for many, many years and called The Rest of the Story. He was known for that. He's a great storyteller. And anyway, he had this one radio show in 1964 that was awesome. It basically was a prophetic proclamation of what he saw coming into America in 1964. But little would we realize how true what he said was and would come to pass. And so let's listen to that, and I'll come right back to you.
If I were the devil, if I were the devil, if I were the prince of darkness, I'd want to engulf the whole world in darkness, and I'd have a third of its real estate and 4/5 of its population, but I wouldn't be happy until I had seized the ripest apple on the tree, thee. So I'd set about, however necessary, to take over the United States. I'd subvert the churches first. I'd begin with a campaign of whispers. With the wisdom of a serpent, I would whisper to you as I whispered to Eve, do as you please. To the young, I would whisper that the Bible is a myth. I would convince them that man created God instead of the other way around. I would confide that what's bad is good and what's good is square. And the old I would teach to pray after me, Our Father, which art in Washington. And then I'd get organized. I'd educate authors in how to make lurid literature exciting so that anything else would appear dull and uninteresting. I'd threaten TV with dirtier movies and vice versa. I'd peddle narcotics to whom I could. I'd sell alcohol to ladies and gentlemen of distinction. I'd tranquilize the rest with pills. If I were the devil, I'd soon have families at war with themselves, churches at war with themselves, and nations at war with themselves, until each in its turn was consumed. And with promises of higher ratings, I'd have mesmerizing media fanning the flames. If I were the devil, I would encourage schools to refine young intellects, but neglect to discipline emotions. Just let those run wild. Until before you knew it, you'd have to have drug-sniffing dogs and metal detectors at every schoolhouse door. Within a decade, I'd have prisons overflowing. I'd have judges promoting pornography. Soon I could evict God from the courthouse, then from the schoolhouse, and then from the houses of Congress. And in his own churches, I would substitute psychology for religion and deify science. I would lure priests and pastors into misusing boys and girls and church money. If I were the devil, I'd make the symbol of Easter an egg and the symbol of Christmas a bottle. If I were the devil, I'd take from those who have and give to those who wanted until I had killed the incentive of the ambitious. And what'll you bet? I couldn't get whole states to promote gambling as the way to get rich. I would caution against extremes in hard work, in patriotism, in moral conduct. I would convince the young that marriage is old-fashioned, that swinging is more fun, that what you see on TV is the way to be. And thus I could undress you in public, and I could lure you into bed with diseases for which there is no cure. In other words, if I were the devil, I'd just keep right on doing what he's doing.
All right, that was an awesome program, wasn't it? Just so on point. Just everything that he said, he didn't know it was there. And so in 1965, when I look back on that time, and I was 13 years old, and this picture shows myself on the right side, my four sisters, and my mom and my dad, and we were a good family growing up in the South. And my dad owned a toy store and later became head of a distributorship. And so my mom and dad loved each other very much. She was a stay-at-home mom, and we had milk delivered to our doorstep. Shows you how old we were, and racial discrimination was a big deal back then. And it had really, we were just coming out of a very difficult season of racially charged communities. And, America took pride in the nation. You wouldn't see any flag burning back then, and you wouldn't see anybody putting a knee on the ground when the anthem was sung. And so it was a time after World War II that we saw many people very prideful about our nation after winning that war and winning our freedoms. People didn't live together before marriage back then. It was very infrequent, and people usually waited before they had sex. Not always, but more so than today, where it's so commonplace. And we went to church every Sunday, and we usually had Sunday dinner together. And, one thing about that generation was they were not that well connected emotionally. We really encourage that today in our country and in families and relationships. The whole emotional connection seems to be even greater today, even though the family is more fractured than ever before. And but that World War II generation was a little less emotional in their ability to connect. Divorce was a very shameful thing back then. If you went through a divorce, you had a lot of shame. And so there was a lot of, discouragement for you getting a divorce based on that, and it was harder for women to get a divorce because, women were not as much in the workforce. A lot of them were at home. And so we saw, that dynamic playing out. Today, mom and dad in the workforce, it makes it a little easier for the spouse to leave if they decide that it gets too tough. But in 1967, my dad was killed in an airplane crash when I was 14 years old. And that really changed things in our family. And as I say, he was the president, and the CEO and vice president were in that plane, and my dad was the pilot of this single-engine aircraft. And so when that went down, life really changed. My mom and dad were very much in love with each other. And, so things changed. She had to go back to work because the insurance didn't pay off in the whole accident because the insurance was tied up in the company. The company went bankrupt within 2 years because of those three executives. And that's why you don't have executives fly on the same plane at the same time. That is the reason you don't do that. And so I would end up going to school at the University of South Carolina on a golf scholarship. I was a very good golfer starting from age 11, became really good and a tournament player, and turned pro out of college. But I didn't reach my dream. It was really what led me to Christ when I was 22 years old. I would later get into business and ultimately would own an ad agency. And as a result of that, we had a great run for about 12 years. The name of our company was the Aslan Group, named after the Chronicles of Narnia, Aslan, the lion. And we had great clients like Steinway Pianos and American Express and Thomas Nelson and Parisian Department Stores, which is now Belk, and some carpet companies. And so anyway, we had a great run for 12 years, but in 94, I went through a major crisis, and it would last for 7 years. I would lose over $500,000. My wife would leave me. My vice president would take my second largest account. My largest account would fire me and stick me for $140,000. And, many of you know my story. But anyway, that took me into that season. It was in that season that God birthed what I'm doing today that would ultimately allow me to go to 26 countries to equip leaders all over the world to help them understand what it means to live their faith in and through their working life and to manifest Christ's presence in the area of their calling. And so it's been a great ride. And, God turned me into a writer through that experience. I've just finished my 19th book that will come out next year. And, done a lot of workshops and training over the years. So let's get right into our teaching today. And let's ask the question, why have we lost so much ground in culture? Well, one of the reasons is in the pre-Civil War time, the gospel of the kingdom was preached. It wasn't focused on the gospel of salvation only. And post-Civil War, we began to have a more focus on the rapture and the gospel of salvation. And as a result of that, we began to see dualism in calling and a failure to equip believers in the area of their work life and their influence. And we sort of gave over the culture, if you will, because we said, well, why bother? The rapture's coming. Why do we need to even focus on, winning the culture? Well, in 1975, Bill Bright and Lauren Cunningham met for the very first time, and they tell each other in that meeting that God spoke to each of them independently and said, if we're going to shape culture, it's going to have to be through these 7 spheres of arts and entertainment: business, education, family, government, media, and religion. And so we began to make reference to those as the 7 cultural mountains. Some call them gates, some call them spheres, mind molders. Doesn't really matter what you call them, but they're all are places of influence. And so Francis Schaeffer came along shortly after that and began to basically preach that same message. And so they began to raise up and disciple young people to see these spheres as a place to really influence the culture. The only problem was they didn't have that great of influence because these were young people living on support, and it wasn't penetrating the marketplace, the adults who were in the marketplace who actually resided on those mountains. And so today, though, we do see a renewal of that message, and that God is really doing a mighty work by using this as a strategy. It's not dominionism. It's not another religion. It's simply a strategy to influence the culture for Christ. And it's interesting how when movements start, how people pick up the wrong message about a particular movement. And, this whole accusation around dominionism is ridiculous. And so anyway, just think about it as another evangelism strategy to influence the culture. When we look at these 7 areas, we break it down by the family as being where the emotional health and well-being of the culture is. Media, education, arts and entertainment is where we define worldview, our beliefs, and values. And in government, this is where we adopt our laws and interpret them and enforce those laws. In business, we have prosperity and economy and business, and that's a place of real influence in many cases. And then the church is where we should see God, morality, and values really expressed in the culture. And of course, families reside on every one of these mountains. Now in Isaiah 2:2, we discover why we reference these areas as 7 mountains. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. There's our personal mountain where I have my relationship with God and my family, and then my career mountain is where business and education, arts and entertainment and media, and then our community is where government and church reside, all under the mountain of the Lord. And the Lord says, there's going to be one day they're all going to fall under the mountain of the Lord. Now, one of the things we've learned over the many years that we've been teaching in this area is that culture is defined by only 3 to 5% of leadership at the top of a cultural mountain. Just think about how the gay rights movement has been so effective at shifting their issue from being a moral issue to being a civil issue. They've even tried to hijack the civil rights movement that, many leaders in that movement began to resent that whole association because it has really no relationship to the types of discrimination we're talking about here. We're talking about a people that have a preference about their sexual orientation. And we know that no one is born gay. That is clearly medically proven that no one is born gay. They can have tendencies, but most of the time, people who are gay, it is a result of some type of an event that happened in their life, usually a father figure that has wounded them deeply. And that's an issue that we don't need to get into today. But when we look at these 7 spheres, the church needs to be right in the center of it. And as a result, government, economics, celebration, education, media, and the gay rights have been very effective at penetrating all of these spheres. They went into government and changed laws. They went into arts and entertainment and got roles in movies and sitcoms and began to shift America's view of that issue. And then in the family, they changed a lot of things in the family. We'll talk about it in a minute. They got roles in media where they got key roles, like CNN has 2 gay anchors, and they don't mind saying that they're gay. And so culture is really changing, and the things that we thought were really immoral is now being changed to see it differently. 1 Corinthians 16:9 says, "A great door for effective work has opened to me, and there are many who oppose me." Now, this is Paul speaking, and he says basically there are certain mountains that have greater demons on top of them, and government and arts and entertainment would be 2 of those for sure, and so we see that every day. Now, Abraham Kuyper was a great Christian leader in politics. He was a prime minister in the Netherlands from 1901 to 1905. And he said, "Oh, no single piece of our mental world is to be hermetically sealed off from the rest. There's not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry mine." And so, it's important for us to realize when Jesus prayed the Lord's Prayer in Luke 11, he says, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So that's what we were trying to do, is bring heaven on earth in order to manifest God's presence in all of these 7 areas and beyond. And see, culture has a number of ingredients to it, culture change. And the key one that has to be first base is prayer. Daniel models this in how he prayed for his government and his nation. And then we have to equip the leaders. Ephesians talks about equipping the saints, and that the 5-fold ministry, and we have to equip us to go out and do the work of the ministry. And our pastors are not the ones there for that. We are there. We're the ones that go into the culture. And then one of the key ingredients that we'll talk about later is problem solving, how Jesus was a problem solver, and as a result, he had influence. And then the 7M strategy, 7 mountain strategy, is a great way to begin to touch culture strategically. And we know that we can only do that through networks and collaboration, where we take our time, talent, and treasure and multiply that and leverage it in the culture. So in 1620, 41 pilgrims and colonists signed the Mayflower Compact, and they came to America. And one of the things that was in that compact was this statement: the colonists would live in accordance with the Christian faith. And so let it be known that there's no doubt that our nation was founded based on Christian beliefs, not Mormon beliefs, not Muslim beliefs, not any other beliefs other than Christians. And they came over from England and wanted to come to a promised land to establish freedom of religion, not freedom from religion in government, but freedom to practice their religion. And then for 200 years, we know that the children were trained by a book called the New England Primer. And this book taught our kids to write and to learn English. And a lot of the words in that book were scripture verses. So they were learning the Bible while they were learning to write. And that lasted for 200 years. And so we need to understand these foundations are very important for us to recognize. Now, why is America in trouble now, though? We are the frog in the kettle, where the frog begins to heat up more and more to the point that one day they don't know that the water is so hot that he ends up dying. How in the world did we get to this place? Well, let's take a look at some tipping points over about 50 to 100 years. Deuteronomy 28 tells us there's a blessing and a cursing that takes place when a nation does all the right things according to God versus disobeying God. Then there are blessings and curses. And certainly we can see a lot of the curses that are starting to show up in our nation. And so when we live as a disobedient nation, we can expect those curses to come to us. And in 1857, the National Education Association came along and they began to liberalize education. They began to gradually move God out of the conversation and began to depend upon reason, logic, and knowledge. And knowledge became our God. And that's why we see so many of the education institutions today without God. And yet many of them founded on Christian foundations. Yale, Harvard, Columbia, all of those were original training grounds for pastors and church leaders. And yet now you cannot find any vestiges of that. In the 1930s, many of the people in Hollywood were reaching out to churches and pastors and asking them to send their young people to Hollywood to help them make movies. But instead, they said, no, we don't want anything to do with that evil community. And so we gave over Hollywood to the unrighteous. 1953, Playboy was birthed, and that's when we began to see sexual promiscuity, pornography, and many of the sexual revolution initiatives began that year. And so it was interesting that last year, when Hugh Hefner died, so many of the Me Too movement began to birth, and we began to see judgment among many of the people that had been sexually promiscuous in industries. Many people lost their jobs in the media, in arts and entertainment, and other places. And so I thought it was interesting that I think a stronghold got taken down when Hefner got taken down and died. And and in 1963, prayer was removed from schools, and we saw a further removal of the protection of God over the schools. And we began to see more violence in schools. We began to see test scores go down in schools. And so we're continuing to see that slide. And in 1973, Roe versus Wade, 61 million abortions since that law was passed. And so we have blood on our hands. And then 1997, the gay agenda, the first woman kissed another woman on national television in 1997. And this ushered in the LGBT movement that began to grow, very radicalized. These people are very aggressive, they're very organized, and they're well funded. And then in 2000, we began to see relativism. Relativism says that anything goes as long as it doesn't affect me. And we saw that our young people bought into that. We see that today, young people have a hard time believing absolutes. They are very politically correct, and they don't want to, stir up the waters, if you will, by using an absolute belief. And then in 2015, the Supreme Court passed the Marriage Act and redefined marriage from being a man and a woman to two consenting adults. So we've seen our nation move from a moral and spiritual culture to a secular culture and the family breakdown. We now have less than 50% of those in the home are two-parent households, and that's a major thing. So civil versus moral government is what we're seeing live out today. This is a result of decades of compromise, and we begin to see all of these things, socialism and bigotry and free speech, Christian persecution, all these things are beginning to show up more and more. Well, could you have ever imagined? That's the statement I often say when I hear the news every week. Could you imagine? Can you imagine that actually they believe that, or they have actually said that? It's crazy, that what we're seeing go on today. For instance, could you have imagined that people would prefer socialism over capitalism? We know by case studies that socialism does not work. All it does is make dictators and lessens the individual ability to create wealth and prosperity for the individual. Yet we see that there's a movement toward socialism instead of capitalism today, especially in the liberal democratic influence of that party. 61 million abortions since Roe versus Wade, as I said, but one of the major things that happened in 2019 was that the New York legislature said it was now perfectly legal to murder a baby one day after its birth. Now that is just unheard of. That reminds me so much of Baal sacrifices in the Old Testament. How sad it's hard to believe that we have a nation that would allow that to take place. We're also losing many of our Christian liberties that we've had. The liberal side of America is trying to make conservative values hate speech, even refusing businesses to come into a city because of their Christian and conservative values. Who could have ever imagined? Isaiah 5:20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." You see, we can't call things that are evil good, and no matter how much the society begins to accept it, it doesn't change the truth. Could you have believed the drag queen story is now part of elementary schools and public libraries where men dress in women's clothing, reading homosexual-themed books to children? This, according to their own website, captures the imagination and play of the gender fluidity of childhood and gives kids glamorous, positive, and unabashedly queer role models. All that's going to do is screw up our kids. And if you don't believe that that is from the pit of hell, then you simply are being hoodwinked by the culture. It reminds me of the verse out of Romans that talks about a reprobate mind. When we say no to God's principles and values and foundations, we will ultimately begin to make choices that will lead to a reprobate mind. Likewise, also the men leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God, in their knowledge God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. You see, these are works of the flesh, and that God is telling us that this is the consequence of saying no to God in government, no to God in the values that are represented by the Word of God. This is what you'll get. You'll get a consequence of disobedience. You see, truth doesn't change because the culture doesn't like it. John 14:6-7 says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." That never changes. Culture is going to violate truth whether they like it or not, if it violates the Bible. But we do have a giant that is sleeping. There are 100 million born-again Christians in America. 50 million of them are registered to vote, but sadly, only 25 million show up to vote. These are often confused on who to vote for. Many liberals don't like each other, but they're willing to work together for their collective cause, while Christians on the opposite side like each other but refuse to work together. While we preached and prayed, the left discipled the nations, said my friend Lance Wallnow. Revelation 2:5 tells us, "Remember, therefore, from where you've fallen, repent and do the first works, or else I will come to you quickly and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent." You see, there's no guarantees that America will be here in 50 years. The Roman Empire looked like it could never fail, but it did. 1 Corinthians 3:11, Paul tells us that for no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. You build upon any other foundation, it's not going to last. And our foundation is cracked. We need to understand the signs of the times, just like the sons of Issachar did, in order to know what to do. We have a perfect storm today. We see all of these events taking place in our nation. Any of those events could catalyze and cause us to move into a more severe condition than we already are. So we need to be praying. Is it too late for America? Well, God said that if there were 10 righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah, he would spare it. I pray that God has mercy on America. If we're going to begin to impact the culture, we must also engage the culture to influence it. Sometimes we must go into places that are unfriendly to dispel the prejudices held by those who oppose it. That's what happened with me in 2011. Myself and 9 other leaders went there to speak at a community transformation conference. And we were very excited about it. But within 2 weeks, many of us who were the speakers began to see lies spread about us all over the internet. I couldn't believe some of the things I was doing out there, that these lies were being spoken about us on the internet. And what it turned out was the LGBT community and the Muslim community did a media blitz against us. They were trying to shut the conference down. They went to the dean and tried to shut us down, but were not able to do so. And so the event came, and it was a successful event. But during the event, we had 50 different protesters that came out and protested against us. There was a placard with my name on it, that the person was trying to tie me to legislation in Uganda that had happened before I'd ever gotten there, and I did not support that legislation. And so when we had the event was over, we were in the coffee area, and we saw that many of the protester leaders were in the coffee area, and we asked them to come sit with us. And you can see them in the third picture on the right. Those are the leaders of the protest, with myself and Lance Wallnow and Rodney Sampson there on my right. And so we let them talk and tell us what was on their mind. We had a Harvard professor that moderated our time together. So we said, "What's on your mind?" And so they began telling us things and accusing us of things. And the man who was accusing me was right there next to me in that picture on my left. And when he began bringing up the Uganda thing, I said, I was never in Uganda during that legislation, nor would I have supported that legislation. He said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, and that's the truth." And he said, "I've wrongfully judged you, haven't I?" I said, "Yeah, you have." He said, "Would you like me to do a retraction in the Harvard paper?" I said, "That would be great." So we had this conversation. We didn't agree with them on many of the points they were making, but we didn't get angry. Well, by the end of the meeting, we had a very cordial relationship building between us. The Harvard professor said, "Gentlemen, I just went through this conference, and they said nothing negative about you guys. It would be a conference we would be glad to have anytime at Harvard. You've wrongfully judged them." And so what we found was that here we had the opportunity to build a bridge into a group who thought we were one thing, but we're not. Even though we still had our Christian values, we weren't the kind of people they thought we were. And so to influence the culture, we must understand the viewpoints of those who see things differently than us. Jesus calls us to love our enemies, not necessarily agree with them. Jesus didn't agree with the tax collector's business practices. Colossians 4:6 says, "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one." I mentioned earlier that culture is defined by only 3 to 5% of a leadership at the top of a cultural mountain. It's believed that America was formed by as little as about 500 individuals, forming an entire nation. The Supreme Court case, Roe versus Wade, was won by a handful of people by knowing what to do at the Supreme Court level. We see a whole group of people that are trying to take God out of culture, and George Soros is part of that equation. After the year 2000, when George Bush won the election, the left decided they had to do something to counter the effectiveness of the conservatives. They developed an $18 billion strategy, and they created all sorts of organizations designed to take God out of our culture and to discredit Christians in the media, and a whole strategy to affect culture in a very negative and liberal basis. And that got me thinking that, over the years, we've been trying to equip leaders effectively to counter this kind of assault on America. And so we've been considering a new initiative that will be coming out in the first of the year. And if this is something you want to be aware of when we come out with it, you can get on our waiting list. And to get on our waiting list to be notified when we start letting people know about it, just go to becomegodschangeagent.com. That's becomegodschangeagent.com. We'll also give you a free download of my top 10 biblical truths for succeeding in life and work, just for putting your name on that list. And I'm confident you're going to be interested in what we are going to be sharing in this new initiative. So you're called to relationship with God, the larger story of your life, to be an influencer and God's change agent. And God has a process for making you his culture shaper. And that's what many of these podcasts are all about, is helping you become God's change agent. And as I mentioned, the Change Agent book is one of my primary resources to help you really understand. And we talk about each of the 7 cultural mountains in here, and how the nation got where it is today in much more detail than what I'm sharing today. But if you want to go deeper in that subject, that might be something of interest to you. So why was Jesus so influential? It was because he was a problem solver. He solved lots of problems. He solved Peter's fishing problem. He solved Peter's tax problem. He fed 5,000 people when there was no food. He solved the blind man's seeing problem, and he solved the prostitute's problem and kept her from being stoned. And so whenever you solve a problem, you have influence. See, culture doesn't care who solves their problem. They just want their problem solved. And when you do that, you automatically have influence. You want to impact your community? Start solving a problem. Start networking with churches and businesses, and go to the mayor and say, what's your greatest problem? And start trying to solve that problem. He'll be coming back to you very shortly. So why did Daniel and David and Joseph have influence? They solved problem for their employer. And so if you, in the workplace, want to have greater influence at the workplace, solve a problem. Can we be trusted with a problem to bring a God solution to it? I hope we can. That's what God calls us to do. William Wilberforce was a problem solver. He came to Christ when he was 28, very wealthy man. But he had 18 other individuals that he began to leverage their time, talent, and resources, known as the Clapham Group. And they had 69 world-changing initiatives, not the least of which was the abolishment of slavery. So, Paul said in 1 Corinthians 2:4, "And my speech and my preaching were not with wise, persuasive words of human wisdom, but in a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God." If Jesus can transform the life of a terrorist, he can transform our greatest enemy and our greatest liberal politician. It's time the church developed a new strategy that's more effective, that's going after the influencers. In March 2019 of this year, we hosted an International Culture Shapers Summit. I had 350 leaders of leaders come together at this summit. We had 50 different presentations, if you can imagine that. We had Roma Downey in arts and entertainment, Steve Green in business, A.R. Bernard, the church, Dale Tackett in education, and Tony Perkins in the family, Hugh Hewitt in media, and Ken Blackwell for government. These were our keynote speakers, along with Lance Wallnow and myself and a few others. And this time gave us an opportunity to understand the signs of the times and hear strategies for influencing culture. And so if you are interested in knowing more about that and actually listening to any of those presentations, I encourage you to do that. You can find them at cultureshaperssummit.com, cultureshaperssummit.com, and you'll find all of our presentations there. Some powerful, powerful messages were at that meeting. So, 2 companies that impacted culture by standing against unrighteousness. Business has probably the greatest influence of any of those 7 spheres to actually make changes. Chick-fil-A has been a great model for influencing culture by standing up against the LGBT community. And so, here they have handled that very well. And so we need to pray for companies like that are on the front lines. And how about Hobby Lobby that fought the contraceptive initiative in the Obamacare and won that case, and at the cost of what could have been the cost of their entire company. So Edmund Burke said, the only thing necessary for triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. So I hope that's not you. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? Psalm 11, verse 3. So as I mentioned to you, get on our waiting list, become godschangeagent.com, and you'll be notified of what's coming up in the near future so that you can be part of something major that we're going to launch. Now, if you're listening on iTunes, please rate our podcast. It's so helpful if you rate us, because when you rate us, it lets other people know that we're worthy of listening to. It lets Apple know that as well, and so it will open our site up to more people. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our podcast and share your comments below. That helps us also generate more interest in our podcasts. So it's been great being with you. I will see you next week. God bless.
Are you a biblical worker? Do you know what the Bible says about how to work biblically? I've got a great resource I want to give you called Are You a Biblical Worker? It's a 50-question true-false self-assessment, great for personal study and small groups. Plus, you get the answers with supporting scriptures to help you apply what the Bible says about your daily work life. It's a value of $25, but we want to make it available to you as a free ebook. Just go to www.freebiblicalworker.com. That's freebiblicalworker.com.